I'm here at 66 Portland Place, the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, known as the RIBA, designed in the 1930s by George Gray Wornham, alongside his wife Miriam Wornham, and a whole range of assistants, collaborators, artists, craftsmen, builders and other architects. This is a fascinating building, one of the exemplary buildings of the 1930s in all its decorative richness inside and out. But what makes it particularly interesting, I think, is that this is a building designed by architects for architects. It's a monument to professionalisation, for good or ill, built at a time when the modern profession of architecture was being forged. That coincidence makes it particularly rich and particularly worth reflecting on. It tells us a lot about how architects understood themselves, what they did and where they fit, and how they thought architecture could communicate their values and purpose to the wider public. By the early 1930s, the RIBA had expanded significantly from what was a small metropolitan club founded a century earlier to an imperial institute. With its membership standing at around 6,000, it had outgrown its rather gentlemanly and club-like premises at 9 Conduit Street, where its swelling and rather valuable collections were being heated by coal fire and lit by candlelight. The move to Portland Place then was about space, but it was also about modernisation for 3 main purposes. To create a house of architecture, a public or semi-public institutional building, a place for the public to visit for talks, a members club, a series of spaces for members to meet, to socialise and to politic, and a machine for administration. There was a growing, powerful executive, architectural mandarins, who actually did the work of running the bureaucracy, a kind of civil service for this Whitehall of professionalism. I'm in the library on the 3rd floor, reconceived as a modern information centre in the 1930s, and I want to show you 3 early projects by the architect of the building, George Gray Wornham. These drawings from the early part of his career tell us something really important about where he came from as a designer. Wornham was typical of his generation in that he was part trained as an apprentice and part trained in an architecture school. This first drawing, a domestic project for Seatown near Bridport in Dorset, has all the typical features of the arts and crafts. Low eaves in thatch with pretty dormers, a brick chimney and a rough cast face, painted green shutters, a little birdhouse, and in plan, asymmetrical, an L-shaped window seat overlooking the garden terrace and an inglenook fireplace. On the other hand, this is Wornham's study of the French town of Richelieu, designed by the architect Jacques Le Mercier in the 17th century, an ideal town plan, axially planned, which Wornham studied on a trip abroad funded by a prize at the AA, and including his neat, measured drawings of the elevations round the central squares. And then finally, I want to show you some mock-ups of a decorative scheme for the Derby Dance Hall, which Wornham refitted, collaborating with the artist Walpole Champneys, to create these riotous, intensely decorative, carnivalesque interiors using imagined scenes of 18th century conviviality. But Wornham was also interested in modern developments, and there are a number of influences at play on his practice and indeed the design of this building. There's much of Ragnar Osterberg's City Hall and echoes of Gunnar Asplund's Stadsbibliotek, the City Library. But I see a much closer link to Ivar Tengbom's Konserthuset, or Concert Hall. The rhythm of the fenestration on the main facade is remarkably similar to that of the Weymouth Street facade of 66 Portland Place. There's also an American accent, married to a wealthy San Franciscan heiress, Miriam Gersel, an artist and painter in her own right. He was exposed to North American jazz moderne architecture. There's a very good chance that the San Francisco Pacific Exchange was a strong influence on Portland Place. I want to think now about how the building was planned, how Wornham handled space, solids and voids, mass and volume, transparency and opacity. Wornham's competition design was broadly similar in compositional mode to the building as eventually built. The height of the competition design was reduced to, additional stories for lettable office accommodation were eventually omitted, and on a smaller footprint it was decided to retain neighbouring 68 Portland Place. Wornham used a steel frame, by this time a standard construction method, which essentially generated a grid to guide the design. You can see how this determines the rhythm of the principal bays in this section or cut-through of the building. Quote, "Architect and structural engineers have worked with a degree of harmony and mutual understanding that is unusual," the RIBA journal recorded. The building is organised around a large central void which accommodated a triple height staircase and the bulk of two substantial public spaces. Then around these were organised smaller compartments, prestige offices and committee rooms to the front, and other offices and lounges, more private spaces down the quieter side road of Weymouth Street. This clear tectonic fit all the volumes within a cube, spaces slot together like a tower at the start of a game of Jenga. Let's look briefly at the differing functions of the building. The ground floor was for institute business, essentially offices for senior staff, a general office for clerks, and a soundproofed typist's office with an illuminated notice board. The first floor and the mezzanine on the way down to the basement were the principal public rooms, the Henry Jarvis Hall, the main auditorium and lecture theatre, and on the first floor, the Henry Florence Memorial Hall. The Florence Hall was both a meeting room, a banqueting hall, an exhibition gallery, and an examination hall. The second floor was for the membership. There were dozens of committees for members that comprised the machinery of the Institute, setting policy and guidance, getting a grip on the evolving aspects of professional practice and design. They needed places to meet, and 3 committee rooms lined the Portland Place facade. The North and South committee rooms sandwiched the much more grandly decorated near double-height Aston Webb committee room, with kid leather panels and a green lino-top table brought over from Conduit Street and reconditioned. The principal meeting room served as the heart of the building, but the library was the brain, the information centre of the profession. The most modern and up-to-date equipment and methods of information gathering were used. The library produced the journal and was closely connected to the public relations function, which had neighbouring offices. And then at the crown, or summit, was the council chamber, much like a papal conclave, with scarlet leather upholstery and rich walnut veneers lining the walls. Luxuriating in materials is completely characteristic of Wornham's interior. This is a building so much about fine craftsmanship and ornament. This was a building trying to say something about the nature of architecture and indeed the nature of architectural meaning. The plaster relief plaques on the ceiling of the Florence Hall show the various workers engaged on the project. Jan Uter etching glass, the carpenter, the bricklayer, the plumber, and oddly, the sculptor in the guise of an electrician having a light bulb moment. These all reflect the building processes used in the construction and decoration of the building. Wornham and his contemporaries believed in the supremacy of the architect, but valued their collaborators in the craftspeople and contractors they worked with. They tried to fulfill what has been called a medieval modern ideal, all working together to create a kind of cathedral of the crafts, integrated, holistic, collaborative. On the jamb and soffit of the double-height opening accommodating the staircase to the upper levels, we see this too in the rough gilded lab, a 1930s thick gesso or stucco, exalting the tools of construction, from concrete mixers, drills and rivet guns for the foundations and structure, to electrical wiring and plastering, through to the furnishing trades, expressed through paint and brushes for decoration right at the top. And we see this on the outside as well. Along Weymouth Street, the architect, in the guise of Sir Christopher Wren, alongside the sculptor, the painter, the artisan and the mechanic. This was a celebration, in other words, of the production of architecture, of the collaboration of the trades, the arts and the profession. 66 Portland Place was a temple not just to the professionalisation of architecture, but also to the art of building. On an exceptionally tight site, client and architect created an intensely packed, rational programme for a profession and its bureaucracy seeking to remake the profession for a democratic age. But more than that, it was a building whose designers, makers, builders and users reflected self-consciously on what architecture meant. It positioned architecture and the architect, yes, at the centre of things, but at the centre of a much wider world of making and craft. That might be a lesson worth heeding for the profession that occupies these spaces today.